Welcome to a journey into one of the greatest mysteries of human history. It is a bright, golden summer morning in the year 1914. Cafes in Paris are full of people drinking coffee and reading morning newspapers. In London, businessmen are trading goods with partners all over the globe. Across the continent, trade is booming. Wealth is growing. People genuinely believe that a large-scale war is a thing of the distant past. Humanity, they think, has simply become too civilized, too advanced, and too interconnected for such primitive violence. Yet, within a matter of weeks, this confident, modern continent will plunge into the darkest, most destructive mystery of the modern age. How does a golden summer turn into a global graveyard? How do the smartest, most educated leaders in the world trap themselves in a burning room? This is not just a story of generals and kings. This is a story about human psychology. It is a story about what happens when fear builds a machine that nobody knows how to turn off. Listen to this phrase, the glittering surface. In English, it means it looks shiny, beautiful, and perfect on the outside. But it might hide something highly dangerous or ugly underneath. Europe in 1914 had a glittering surface. The kings and emperors of Britain, Germany, and Russia were actually cousins. They wrote friendly letters to each other, sometimes signing them with affectionate nicknames. They attended the same royal weddings and shared meals. The surface was perfectly calm. But to solve the mystery of World War I, we must look deeply beneath that surface. We must look at an invisible web stretching across the entire map. This web was made of fear, and it was made of paper. In the decades leading up to 1914, Europe was experiencing unprecedented industrial growth. Listen for the word unprecedented. It means something that has never been done or known before. Factories were producing unprecedented amounts of steel, chemicals, and machines. But they were also mass-producing terrifying new weapons. When your neighbor builds a massive army, you naturally feel afraid. So, what do? You build a bigger army to protect yourself. Then, your neighbor sees your new army, and they feel afraid. They build even more weapons. This psychological virus, this spreading fear, is what historians call an arms race. The word race here does not mean a fun running competition. It means a desperate, panic-driven competition to build more military power than anyone else. Militarism acted like a pathogen, infecting the minds of everyday citizens. Grand parades, bright uniforms, and loud national pride made people completely blind to the actual horror of modern industrial weapons. Because of this constant, quiet terror, countries began to seek friends. They wanted guaranteed protection. This brings us to a vital word for our story: alliance. An alliance is a formal agreement between countries to protect each other. If one nation is attacked, the others promise to fight alongside them. Think of an alliance system exactly like the nervous system in the human body. If you stub your toe, the pain does not just stay in your foot. Your whole body reacts instantly. The nerves send a signal, your brain registers pain, your mouth shouts, and your hands reach down. Europe had built a massive political nervous system. A small pain in one tiny corner of the map would instantly force the whole continent to react in violent shock. There were two main nervous systems competing for dominance. On one side stood the Triple Entente. Entente is a French word that simply means an understanding or a friendly agreement. This massive group included Britain, France, and Russia. Notice how we use the word stood. We say, on one side stood the Triple Entente. This is a powerful historical phrase. It shows firm, unmoving positions. You can practice this structure yourself to describe conflicts. On one side stood the Empire. On the other stood the rebels. Facing them was the second great nervous system, the Triple Alliance. This equally powerful team included Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. The political leaders of Europe thought these alliances would keep everyone perfectly safe. It was called the balance of power. The idea was simple. If both teams are incredibly strong, no one will be foolish enough to start a fight. The logic was that mutual fear would guarantee mutual peace. But a system built entirely on fear and rigid rules is deeply fragile. It is like a dark room filled with invisible gas, just waiting for a single spark. We have now seen the glittering surface of European society. We have uncovered the invisible web of the alliance system, connecting nations together in a trap of their own making. We understand the arms race that filled the continent with explosive tension. But the mystery remains. Who lights the match? The spark that destroys the world does not come from a powerful king. It does not come from a brilliant general. It comes from a sick 19-year-old boy standing quietly on a sunny sidewalk in a city called Sarajevo. In historical English, we often use the word fateful to describe a moment that changes the future in a negative or disastrous way. A wrong turn is usually just a small mistake. But a fateful wrong turn changes the course of human history forever. Next, we will travel to that exact sidewalk. We will watch a royal car take a fateful wrong turn. And we will witness the precise moment the old world breaks apart. The heavy luxury car slows down to fix a simple mapping error. The engine coughs, the gears grind, and the vehicle stalls. In the sudden, awkward quiet of the narrow street, two sharp sounds echo through the summer air, and the modern world breaks apart forever. Let us go back to the beginning of that very morning, June 28th, 1914. The city of Sarajevo, located in modern-day Bosnia, is hot and filled with nervous energy. Flags hang from the buildings. Crowds line the streets. Riding in the back of an open-topped car is Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie. Listen for this phrase, heir to the throne. In English history, the heir to the throne is the person next in line to become the king or emperor. Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the throne of the massive Austro-Hungarian Empire. His visit to Sarajevo was supposed to be a display of royal strength and unity. But beneath the glittering surface we discussed earlier, deep hatred was boiling. There is a strange, accidental twist to this story that makes it feel like a tragic movie. The assassination we are about to witness was not the first attempt of the day. Earlier that morning, as the royal cars drove down the main avenue, an attacker threw a bomb. It bounced off the back of the Archduke's car, and exploded under the vehicle behind them, injuring several officers. Shockingly, after a brief pause, the Archduke decided to continue his official schedule. He even insisted on visiting the wounded officers in the hospital later that afternoon. To keep the Archduke safe on the way to the hospital, his security team decided to change the driving route at the last minute. But they forgot to tell the driver. This is where the story shifts from grand politics to human error. The driver, following the old, outdated route, turns right onto a narrow side street. The officials in the car yell at him to stop. The driver hits the brakes. He tries to put the heavy, awkward car into reverse. The engine stalls. The car sits perfectly still on the street corner. By pure, terrifying coincidence, standing on that exact corner is a 19-year-old student named Gavrilo Princip. He is a member of a secret revolutionary group. He had spent the morning feeling defeated, believing the assassination plot had entirely failed. Suddenly, as if dropped from the sky, the heir to the throne stops just a few feet away from him. Princip steps forward, raises his pistol, and fires twice. This act introduces a vital historical term. This was not a standard murder. Listen for the word assassination. In historical English, an assassination is the planned murder of a highly important political or religious leader, almost always for ideological or political reasons. But why did a teenager want to assassinate an archduke? To understand the deep roots of this mystery, we must introduce another powerful concept: nationalism. Listen closely to how this word is used. Nationalism is an intense, sometimes extreme form of loyalty to your own country or cultural group. It is the belief that your nation is completely separate from, and usually superior to, others. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was an aging giant. Think of it like a fragile human body struggling to hold together many mismatched organs. The empire contained millions of people from different ethnic backgrounds, speaking different languages. Many of these groups, particularly the Slavic people in the south, felt infected by the fever of nationalism. They wanted to tear away from the empire and create their own independent nations. Princip fired his weapon because he believed the death of the Archduke would spark a revolution, freeing his people from imperial control. This brings us to a highly useful phrase you can practice: a chain reaction. You can use this phrase to describe connected events in history, science, or even daily life. A chain reaction means one specific event directly causes the next, which causes the next, exactly like a row of falling dominoes. Princip thought he was simply attacking a symbol of an empire he hated. He did not realize he was pulling the trigger on the massive, invisible alliance system we built in Part 1. He did not know that his 2 pistol shots would echo across the continent, waking up the great armies of Germany, Russia, France, and Britain. The biological fever of extreme nationalism inside one young man was about to infect the global political nervous system. We now know exactly what happened on that sunny sidewalk in Sarajevo. We know how a fateful wrong turn and a stalled engine gave a teenage nationalist the chance to assassinate an empire's future leader. But a profound mystery still remains. Throughout history, kings, queens, and presidents have been assassinated without causing a global apocalypse. Why did this specific tragedy not end with a local police investigation? How does a single political murder in a small southern city drag the entire planet into a mechanical slaughterhouse? The answer lies in the strange, silent weeks immediately following the assassination, a period historians now call the July Crisis. The dominoes are standing in a perfect row, and the empires are about to make their final, deadly calculations. Imagine watching a lit fuse slowly burn toward a massive barrel of explosives, while the people standing right next to it quietly discuss their summer holidays. That was the continent of Europe in July 1914. Following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, there was a strange, eerie silence. If you read the major newspapers from London or Paris during the first few weeks of July, the main headlines were not about impending doom. They were about the weather, local sports, and high society financial scandals. The German Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, even went on his usual summer sailing vacation. To the everyday citizen walking the streets, it looked like the crisis in the Balkans would simply fade away, just like many other regional arguments before it. But behind closed doors, a deadly political game was being played via encrypted telegraph wires. Austria-Hungary wanted to crush Serbia, the small nation they blamed for supporting the teenage assassin. However, the leaders in Vienna knew a crucial, terrifying fact. Serbia was culturally and politically linked to the massive Russian Empire. If Austria-Hungary attacked Serbia, the giant Russian bear would almost certainly attack Austria-Hungary to protect its smaller Slavic brother. Therefore, the Austrians needed a guarantee of safety. They asked their incredibly powerful ally, Germany, for support. Germany's response created one of the most famous and debated diplomatic disasters in history. The German government gave Austria-Hungary what historians call a blank check. Listen to this phrase closely, as it is a highly useful idiom. In historical English, a blank check means giving someone completely unconditional support to do whatever they want, without knowing the final cost. In daily life, if you sign a physical bank check and let someone else write in the money amount, you are giving them a blank check. By offering this political blank check, Germany promised to back Austria-Hungary with its massive army, no matter what actions Austria decided to take. Empowered by this promise, Austria-Hungary sent Serbia an ultimatum. Let us define this vital term. An ultimatum is a final demand attached to a threat of severe punishment if the demand is not met. You can practice this structure. The Empire issued an ultimatum to the rebels. The Austrians deliberately designed their demands to be so deeply humiliating and strict that Serbia would be forced to reject them. Against all expectations, Serbia actually agreed to almost all of the terms, but they did not agree to every single one. For Austria-Hungary, that was enough. On July 28, exactly 1 month after the fateful shots in Sarajevo, Austria-Hungary formally declared war on Serbia. Suddenly, the invisible political nervous system we explored in Part 1 violently woke up. The local infection leaped from the dusty streets of the Balkans directly into the global bloodstream. This declaration of war triggered a terrifying, unstoppable process called mobilization. Listen for this essential historical term. Mobilization is the act of preparing and organizing a nation's troops for active service in war. But in the modern industrial world of 1914, mobilization was not simply gathering a few thousand men in a field with swords. It was a massive, rigid, mechanical beast. It was a massive, rigid, mechanical beast. Millions of men had to be called away from their farms and factory jobs. They had to be given boots, uniforms, and rifles. Most importantly, they had to be loaded onto thousands of steam trains to reach the borders. Think about the biological reflex we mentioned earlier. If a doctor hits your knee with a small rubber hammer, your leg kicks outward automatically. Your brain does not think about it. Your nervous system just reacts. The military timetables in Europe were exactly the same. The train schedules for moving millions of soldiers were mathematically calculated years in advance, down to the exact minute. Once a country pressed the mobilization button, the reflex could not be stopped. When Russia mobilized its giant army to protect Serbia, Germany panicked. Evidence suggests that the German military strategy entirely depended on rapid timing. They believed they had to defeat France quickly before turning east to fight the slower Russian army. So, when Germany saw Russia preparing, Germany immediately mobilized its own forces and declared war on Russia. And then France. When Germany began marching troops through the neutral country of Belgium to attack France, the British Empire, fearing for its own security and outraged by the invasion, was pulled right into the fire. In a span of just a few frantic days, the brilliant, highly educated leaders of Europe found themselves entirely trapped by their own train schedules and defensive treaties. They had built a massive security machine designed to protect them, but the machine had taken over the operators. The dominoes, standing so perfectly in a row, had all collapsed. We have now watched the terrible machinery of the July crisis grind into motion. We have seen how a blank check and an impossible ultimatum turned a localized murder into a continental emergency. We understand the terrifying, involuntary reflex of military mobilization. The complex political crisis is over. The talking, the telegrams, and the diplomacy are completely finished. Millions of young men are now boarding trains, waving goodbye to their weeping mothers and cheering fathers. They are singing patriotic songs, completely convinced by their leaders that they will be home as victorious heroes before Christmas. But what happens when these massive, industrialized armies finally crash into each other? What strange, horrific reality is waiting for them when the train engines stop? They expect a glorious, fast-paced, old-fashioned adventure of cavalry charges and bright uniforms. Instead, the generals are about to discover that their modern weapons have fundamentally broken the old rules of war. Millions of men marched out of their homes in August 1914, wearing bright cloth caps and carrying shining swords. They expected a quick, glorious adventure. Instead, they walked directly into a wall of flying steel. Let us picture the late summer of 1914. The French army is marching across sunny green fields. Many of their soldiers, known as the infantry, are wearing bright red trousers and dark blue coats. Listen for the word infantry. In military English, infantry simply means soldiers who march and fight on foot. Their commanders are riding beautiful horses, drawing shiny steel swords, just as their grandfathers did in the days of Napoleon. They charge forward, expecting honor and a swift victory. But suddenly, the air fills with a mechanical, repetitive sound. A tearing noise, like heavy canvas cloth ripping apart. It is the sound of the modern machine gun. In mere seconds, the colorful cavalry and marching infantry are cut down. The 19th century mindset has just collided violently with with 20th century industrial technology. The shock was absolute. The generals on all sides, British, French, German, and Russian, had built their entire strategy around continuous, aggressive movement. They believed a war would be decided in a few massive, heroic battles over a matter of weeks. They were completely wrong. Evidence suggests that the famous German strategy was designed to capture Paris in roughly 6 weeks, crushing France before the giant Russian army could fully attack from the east. But this strict mathematical plan collapsed. It collapsed under the weight of unexpected resistance, exhausted soldiers, and logistical failures. This brings us to a devastating new word: artillery. Artillery refers to large, heavy guns that fire explosive shells over long distances. In 1914, modern factories had secretly perfected these monstrous weapons. They could drop massive explosives from miles away with terrifying accuracy. If the machine guns swept the soldiers off the open fields, the artillery completely destroyed the fields themselves. The earth literally shook. Forests were turned into splintered wood. Whole villages were erased from the map. Faced with this storm of flying metal, human biology took over. If you're standing in an open field and an invisible enemy shoots at you, what is your most basic animal instinct? You drop to the ground. You hide. You try to put solid dirt between your soft skin and the flying steel. And so, the soldiers began to dig. At first, they dug shallow holes just to survive the night. But the artillery did not stop. So, they dug deeper. They connected their individual holes together into a line. These connected holes became a trench. Listen closely to this essential historical term. A trench is a long, narrow ditch dug into the ground to protect soldiers from enemy fire. Within just a few months, a desperate, muddy race occurred. The opposing armies tried to go around each other, moving further and further north to find an open flank, eventually hitting the ocean. When they could not go around, they kept digging. Soon, a continuous, jagged line of deep ditches stretched from the freezing coast of Belgium all the way down to the mountains of Switzerland. This became known as the Western Front. The glorious, fast-moving adventure was officially over. The war had frozen. We can describe this frozen situation with a powerful English word: stalemate. A stalemate is a situation in a contest or conflict where neither side can make a winning move. It is a complete, frustrating tie. You can use this word in modern contexts, too. For example, the business negotiation ended in a stalemate. To understand this stalemate, think about two giant, angry bulls running at each other at full speed. They crash their heads together with massive force. But instead of one pushing the other backward, they get their horns completely locked. They cannot move forward. They cannot move backward. They simply stand there, bleeding, exhausted, and stuck. The complex alliance system we explored earlier had dragged millions of men into this locked position. The armies were physically trapped in the earth. The beautiful, glittering surface of European civilization was literally buried in the mud. To survive the stalemate, soldiers had to dig in. Listen to this phrase: dig in. Originally, it meant to literally dig a hole to defend a military position. Today, in modern English, if someone digs in, it means they stubbornly refuse to change their mind or alter their position, no matter what happens. The generals of 1914 dug in, refusing to admit their grand strategies had failed. Between the opposing trenches lay a terrifying space. Listen for the phrase, no man's land. In history, this describes the empty, destroyed strip of ground between two enemy trenches. It belonged to no one, and stepping into it meant almost certain death. Today, you might hear no man's land used to describe a gray area or an undefined space, like a controversial topic nobody wants to discuss. We have now watched the old rules of war shatter against the brutal reality of machine guns and heavy artillery. We understand how the fast-moving armies were forced to dig trenches, creating a massive, unbreakable stalemate across the continent. But a dark psychological mystery remains. What happens to the human mind when you place a person in a narrow, wet ditch for months at a time? How does a soldier survive in an environment where simply lifting your head above the dirt means instant death? The reality of trench warfare is unlike anything humanity had ever experienced. The earth itself is about to become an enemy. Imagine the sound of rain falling. For most of us, hearing rain on a roof is a peaceful, comforting experience. But for a young soldier in the autumn of 1915, the sound of rain meant the walls of his entire world were about to melt into a freezing, dangerous soup. We left millions of men hiding from flying steel. To survive the modern artillery, they had to hide inside the earth itself. The trench was not just a simple ditch. It quickly became an incredibly complex underground city stretching for hundreds of miles. Soldiers slept, ate, and wrote letters home in narrow, zigzagging tunnels carved entirely out of dirt. Listen for the idiom, bogged down. In English, a bog is an area of deep, wet, muddy ground. If you step in a bog, you sink, and your boots get stuck. When historians say the European armies were bogged down, it means they were physically stuck in the mud of the trench system. But it also has a broader meaning. It means their progress had completely stopped. You can use this phrase in modern daily life. For example, if you are working on a difficult task, you might say, "Our team got bogged down in paperwork." The human body was not designed to live in cold, wet dirt for months at a time. A terrifying biological reality took over. Because the soldiers' boots were constantly filled with freezing water, a medical condition known as trench foot became widespread. The skin of their feet would freeze, swell, and eventually die. It is a powerful example of how the environment itself became a weapon against human biology. Yet the worst damage was entirely invisible. Above the trench, the heavy artillery fired day and night. The ground violently shook. The noise was deafening. The human brain simply cannot process endless explosions without consequence. Slowly, the minds of many soldiers began to break down under the pressure. This introduces a tragic but essential historical term: shell shock. Listen carefully to this phrase. In World War I, shell shock described the profound psychological trauma soldiers suffered from constant artillery bombardment. Men would shake uncontrollably, lose their memory, or suddenly become blind, even though their eyes were physically perfectly healthy. Today, medical professionals understand this condition as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. But back then, doctors were deeply confused. They initially thought the physical shock wave of the exploding artillery shells had literally bruised the soldiers' brains. The generals of the opposing alliances were desperate. They needed to break this agonizing stalemate. To honor their rigid military strategies, they had to find a way out of the mud. Their solution was brutal in its simplicity: massive, overwhelming infantry attacks. Listen for this famous historical phrase: going over the top. An officer would blow a sharp silver whistle. Hearing that whistle, soldiers had to climb up wooden ladders, step out of the trench, and run directly across no man's land. Going over the top meant leaving safety and charging into a storm of machine gun fire and thick, razor-sharp barbed wire. Today, in modern conversational English, if someone's behavior is too extreme, dramatic, or excessive, we say they are acting over the top. To help soldiers survive crossing no man's land, science introduced terrifying new tools. The first was poison gas. In 1915, a strange yellow-green cloud drifted silently across the battlefield. Because the gas was heavier than air, it sank perfectly down into the enemy trenches. But this new weapon contained a strange, accidental twist. Gas was entirely unpredictable. If the wind suddenly changed direction, the deadly cloud blew right back into the faces of the men who had just released it. Later, the British military introduced a strange, clumsy metal box riding on mechanical tracks. To keep this new invention a secret from enemy spies, they shipped the machines to the front lines in massive wooden crates marked as water tanks. This clever deception is exactly why we still use the word tank in English today. These slow, noisy machines could crush barbed wire and drive right over a trench. But in their early days, they frequently broke down in the deep mud, because the trench lines could not be broken by men or machines. The brilliant commanders slowly realized a dark truth. They could not win by advancing. They could only win by exhausting the enemy. This brings us to a highly critical term: war of attrition. Listen closely. A war of attrition is a military strategy where you try to win simply by wearing the other side down to the point of total collapse. You no longer try to capture land or cities. Instead, you try to completely destroy the enemy's men and resources until they surrender. It is a mathematical equation of suffering. One famous battle plan during this time was specifically designed to simply bleed the enemy white, meaning to cause so many casualties that the opposing army could no longer function. We have now stepped inside the brutal reality of the trench. We have seen how human biology suffered in the mud, and how the mind fractured under constant artillery. We understand that new weapons like gas and tanks were invented to break the stalemate. But they only turned the battlefield into a ruthless war of attrition. But a massive geographical mystery remains. The European armies are completely stuck. They are bleeding to death in the dirt of France and Belgium. Yet remember the title of this conflict. It is a world war. If the armies cannot move forward a single mile in Europe, where do they go? How does a frozen, muddy war in the West suddenly set fire to the vast deserts of the Middle East and the dark, freezing oceans of the Atlantic? The map is about to break wide open. The mud of France is completely frozen. To break the deadlock, the desperate empires look to the freezing oceans. and the burning deserts to find the back door. Imagine the dark, freezing waters of the North Atlantic Ocean in 1915. Beneath the rolling gray waves, a narrow tube of steel is silently hunting. Inside, the air is thick with the smell of diesel fuel, human sweat, and battery acid. Through a periscope, a German submarine captain watches a massive luxury passenger ship sailing toward England. It is a stunning piece of modern engineering, a floating palace on the glittering surface of the sea. But to the captain, it is a mathematical target. He gives a quiet order. A torpedo drops into the water. Why are we looking at a passenger ship? Because the trench lines in Europe were completely stuck. The leaders of the major powers realized that if they could not shoot their way through the enemy, they would have to starve them out. Listen to this crucial historical term: blockade. In English, a blockade is a strict military operation designed to cut off food, supplies, and war materials from entering an enemy country. Britain used its massive, world-class navy to build an invisible wall across the sea. They stopped merchant ships from bringing grain and vital chemicals into Germany. The biological reality was harsh. Without imported fertilizer, German crops failed. A terrible period known as the turnip winter began, and German citizens began to starve in the streets. To fight back against this devastating blockade, Germany unleashed a terrifying new weapon: the Unterseeboot, or U-boat. In English, we simply call it a submarine. To break the British wall, Germany declared a policy called unrestricted submarine warfare. Pay attention to the word unrestricted. It means having no limits, no boundaries, and no rules. The German commanders announced they would sink any ship, even civilian ships from neutral countries, if they believed it was carrying supplies to their enemies. In May 1915, a German U-boat fired a single torpedo at the British ocean liner, called the Lusitania. The ship sank in exactly 18 minutes. Nearly 1,200 people died in the freezing water, including over 100 Americans. Historians debate exactly how much military ammunition was secretly hidden in the ship's cargo hold. But the psychological shock to the world was undeniable. The war had officially moved beyond soldiers in uniforms. Innocent civilians, including women and children, were now trapped in the mechanical crossfire. At the exact same time, the war exploded across the global map. The conflict spread to new fronts. Listen for this word in a military context. A front is a specific geographic area where two opposing armies meet and fight. Because the Western Front was a frozen nightmare, the British and French decided to attack the Ottoman Empire, which had joined the German alliance. In a massive naval and land invasion, British, French, and soldiers from Australia and New Zealand landed on the beaches of Gallipoli, located in modern-day Turkey. They hoped to quickly capture the Ottoman capital and open a safe sea route to supply Russia. But instead of a quick victory, they found another brutal, bloody stalemate. Soldiers traded the wet mud of Europe for the burning sand and towering cliffs of the Mediterranean. This brings us to a concept you must clearly understand: the global empire. This was not just a European war, because Europe did not just stay in Europe. Britain and France controlled massive territories in Africa, India, and Asia. Millions of men from these colonies were drafted into the machinery of war. Indian troops fought freezing battles in the mud of Europe. African laborers were forced to carry heavy supplies through dense tropical jungles. The biological and economic resources of the entire planet were being actively consumed by the conflict. You can use the phrase "drawn into" to describe this process. Listen closely. The whole world was drawn into the war. When you are drawn into something, it means you are pulled into a situation, slowly but forcefully, even if you did not originally want to participate. Whole continents were drawn into a war that had started with 2 pistol shots on a small European sidewalk. We have now watched the conflict escape the mud of the Western Front. We understand how naval blockades forced the invention of unrestricted submarine warfare. We have seen the war spread to new fronts in the Middle East, drawing in millions of people from global colonies to fight and die for foreign kings. The mechanical meat grinder is working at maximum capacity. But a massive, terrible crack is forming in the system, while the British Empire desperately expands its reach. The largest empire on Earth is slowly rotting from the inside out. What happens when an entire nation of millions of starving people decides they have had enough? What happens when an army turns its weapons away from the enemy and points them directly at its own ruler? The invisible web of paper alliances is about to lose a giant piece. A revolution is coming. Imagine standing in the freezing snow for 6 hours just to buy a single loaf of bread. But when you finally reach the front of the line, the bakery is empty. It is early 1917 in Petrograd, the capital of the Russian Empire, and the people are starving, while the British and French are trapped in the mud of the Western Front. The giant Russian army in the east is fighting a completely different kind of nightmare. The Russian Empire had the largest population in Europe. When the war began, millions of peasants were drafted into the military. But Russia was not as industrialized as Germany. Evidence suggests that early in the war, some Russian units were so poorly supplied that men were sent into battle without boots and sometimes even without rifles. They were told to simply pick up a weapon from a fallen comrade. Because of massive military defeats and terrible supply lines, the Russian people lost all faith in their ruler, Tsar Nicholas II. Believing he could fix the crisis, the Tsar made a fatal decision. He traveled to the front lines to take personal command of the army. This meant every new defeat, every lost battle, and every frozen soldier was now his personal fault. Back in the capital, the biological need for survival overpowered the societal rule of law. In February 1917, thousands of angry, freezing women marched through the streets demanding bread. The Tsar, far away at military headquarters, ordered his soldiers in the city to fire into the crowds to stop the protests. Then, the ultimate break in the system occurred. Listen for the word mutiny. In military English, a mutiny happens when soldiers or sailors violently refuse to obey the orders of their commanding officers and take control themselves. Instead of shooting the starving women, the Russian soldiers lowered their rifles. They stepped into the crowd and joined the protest. The military nervous system of the empire simply stopped taking orders from the brain. Without his army, the Tsar had no power. This brings us to a critical historical verb: abdicate. When a monarch abdicates, they formally step down and permanently give up their royal power. In March 1917, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated. The great, centuries-old Russian monarchy collapsed in a matter of days. A temporary government took over. Listen to how we describe this: a provisional government. Provisional simply means temporary, set up only until a permanent solution can be found. You can use this word in daily life too, such as having a provisional driver's license. This provisional government made a tragic mistake. Instead of ending the war, they decided to honor their alliance with Britain and France and keep fighting Germany. The Russian people were furious. They did not want more war. They wanted food and peace. Seeing this chaos, the German military command performed one of the most brilliant and dangerous covert operations in history. They found a radical Russian revolutionary named Vladimir Lenin, who had been living in exile in Switzerland. The Germans put Lenin on a sealed, guarded train and sent him all the way across Europe, directly back into Russia. Remember our theme of biology mirroring society? The German generals treated Lenin exactly like a deadly biological virus. They injected him straight into the bloodstream of the Russian capital, hoping he would infect the nation with revolution and destroy the Russian war effort from the inside. The virus worked perfectly. Lenin and his political party, the Bolsheviks, promised the exhausted public exactly what they wanted to hear. His famous slogan was incredibly simple: peace, land, and bread. In November 1917, in what is known as the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks seized power. True to his word, Lenin immediately pulled Russia out of the war. He signed a harsh peace treaty with Germany, giving up massive amounts of Russian territory. This introduces a phrase you will often hear in historical documentaries: a turning point. A turning point is a specific moment when the entire direction of a story or a conflict completely changes. Russia leaving the war was a massive turning point. For 3 years, Germany had been fighting a desperate two-front war split between France in the west and Russia in the east. Now the Eastern Front was completely closed. Germany could suddenly take hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened soldiers and move them onto trains heading straight for Paris. We have just witnessed the collapse of a massive empire. We have seen how starvation and a military mutiny forced a king to abdicate. We understand how the Germans used a revolutionary thinker as a political weapon to successfully knock Russia out of the global alliance. Germany finally has the numerical advantage on the Western Front. They are preparing the biggest, most devastating attack of the entire war. They believe absolute victory is finally within their grasp. But a shadow is falling over the Atlantic Ocean. The German strategy of unrestricted submarine warfare, which we saw in Part 6, has made a fatal error. By sinking neutral ships, Germany has accidentally awakened a sleeping giant across the sea. A desperate race against time is about to begin. Can Germany crush the French and British armies before thousands of fresh, angry American soldiers step off the boats? The final, bloody climax of the war is rushing toward us. Imagine a secret message translated in a dusty London office that decides the fate of millions of lives. The spring of 1918 is no longer a frozen stalemate. It is a desperate, bloody race against the clock. Let us rewind slightly to January 1917. British intelligence officers in a highly secretive department known as Room 40 are quietly listening to the world. They manage to capture a coded telegraph message. Listen for the word intercept. In English, to intercept means to catch or stop something before it can reach its intended destination. Like a goalkeeper intercepting a football, the British intercepted a message sent by the German Foreign Minister, Arthur Zimmermann, intended for the government of Mexico. The message contained a shocking proposal. Germany knew that their aggressive policy of unrestricted submarine warfare would likely anger the United States. So, the telegram proposed a secret alliance. If the United States declared war on Germany, Mexico should declare war on the United States. In return, Germany promised to help Mexico recover territory it had lost to the U.S. decades earlier. The British gleefully handed this intercepted telegram to the American government. When the American public read it in the morning newspapers, their desire to stay out of the European conflict vanished. This telegram, combined with the continued sinking of American merchant ships, acted as a catalyst. Listen closely to this historical and scientific term. A catalyst is a substance that makes a chemical reaction happen much faster. In history, a catalyst is an event or a specific moment that causes rapid, massive change. On April 6, 1917, the United States Congress officially declared war on Germany. The giant, untouched industrial engine of America was finally turned on. But it takes many months to draft, train, and transport millions of men across the Atlantic Ocean. Germany knew this perfectly well. The German High Command realized they had a very narrow window of time. They had to win the war before the Americans arrived in full force. This brings us to a highly useful English phrase, a race against time. You use this phrase when you must finish a task quickly before a deadline or a disaster occurs. For example, the doctors are in a race against time to save the patient. Germany was in a race against time to defeat France and Britain. With Russia out of the war, Germany moved 500,000 soldiers from the closed Eastern Front to the Western Front. On March 21, 1918, Germany launched a massive military operation. Listen for the word offensive. In military English, an offensive is a large-scale, planned attack intended to aggressively capture territory and destroy the enemy. It is the exact opposite of being defensive. The German Spring Offensive began with the most intense artillery bombardment of the entire war. Millions of explosive shells rained down on the British and French trenches. Then, specially trained German stormtroopers rushed forward. They did not attack in long, slow waves like the armies of 1914. They moved in small, fast groups, running through the fog, bypassing strong points, and pushing deep into enemy territory. For the first time in years, the brutal stalemate of the trench was actually broken. The German army pushed the British and French back for dozens of miles. Panic swept through Paris. It looked as though the massive German gamble was going to work. But a military offensive is exactly like a human runner sprinting a marathon. If you sprint too hard at the beginning, your biological systems run out of oxygen. You burn through your energy too fast. The German army advanced so rapidly that they completely outran their own supply lines. Historical evidence shows that when the starving German soldiers captured British and French trenches, they were shocked to find them filled with canned meat, chocolate, and wine. The naval blockade had starved the citizens of Germany, but the Allied soldiers were well fed. The German troops, entirely exhausted, frequently stopped advancing simply to eat the captured food. The massive offensive began to lose its deadly momentum. And then, stepping into the mud of the Western Front, came the fresh, highly energized American soldiers. They were not exhausted by 4 years of psychological trauma. They arrived by the thousands every single day, pouring fresh blood into the exhausted veins of the Allied war machine. This introduces a beautiful English idiom, turning the tide. Think of the ocean on a beach. When the tide comes in, the water rises. When it turns, the water completely changes direction and pulls back out. In history, turning the tide means completely reversing the advantage in a conflict or a competition. The arrival of the Americans, combined with the sheer physical exhaustion of the German military, successfully turned the tide of the entire war. The Allies began a massive, unstoppable counterattack, pushing the broken German army back toward their own borders. We have now seen how an intercepted telegram and a submarine campaign acted as a catalyst, pulling the United States into the conflict. We have watched Germany risk everything in a massive spring offensive, successfully breaking the trench lines but completely exhausting their starving army. The balance of power has fundamentally shifted. The giant German war machine is running on empty. But how does a global war actually end? Does it finish with one giant, glorious battle? Or does it collapse from the inside out? The generals are preparing for the final clash. But a microscopic, invisible killer is about to enter the battlefield, and it will kill more people than the machine guns ever did. Imagine surviving 4 years of massive artillery explosions, freezing mud, and deadly poison gas, only to be killed by a simple cough. In the final, desperate months of 1918, a completely new, invisible enemy swept across the globe. It did not wear a uniform, and it did not care about alliances. This invisible enemy was a deadly strain of the influenza virus. Historians often refer to it as the Spanish flu. This name is actually a strange historical misunderstanding. Spain was a neutral country during the war, meaning they were not fighting. Because they were not fighting, their newspapers were not heavily censored by the government. When people in Spain started getting sick, the Spanish newspapers honestly reported it. The warring nations, however, deliberately hid the news of the sickness to keep their soldiers' morale high. Because Spain was the only country talking about it, the world incorrectly assumed the disease started there. To understand this biological disaster, listen to the word pandemic. You may know this word from modern times, but its historical impact here is massive. A pandemic is an outbreak of a disease that spreads across multiple countries or entire continents, affecting a massive percentage of the population. The military transportation networks we explored earlier became the ultimate biological highway. Millions of young men were packed tightly into dirty trains, crowded ships, and wet trenches. The virus spread with terrifying speed. Young, healthy soldiers with strong immune systems were suddenly dying in military hospitals within days of showing their first symptoms. It was a tragic mirror of the war itself, a biological massacre completely matching the mechanical slaughter. While the pandemic burned through both sides of the conflict, the German military machine was finally running out of fuel. The British naval blockade had completely ruined the German economy. Civilians were starving in the streets. At the same time, the German army was being pushed backward every single day by the combined British, French, and American forces. This brings us to a very useful English idiom: on the brink. Imagine standing at the very edge of a high cliff. If you take one more step, you will fall. In historical English, if a country or an army is on the brink, it means they are extremely close to a total disaster or a complete collapse. You can use this in everyday life. The exhausted company was on the brink of bankruptcy. By the autumn of 1918, the German Empire was on the brink of total destruction. Germany's partners in their massive alliance began to shatter. The Ottoman Empire surrendered. The fragile Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed from the inside, splitting apart into several smaller independent nations. Germany was completely alone. In late October, the German naval commanders gave a shocking order. They commanded their sailors to take their massive warships out into the ocean for one final aggressive battle against the giant British Navy. It was essentially a suicide mission, designed only to save the traditional honor of the German military. But the sailors were tired, starving, and entirely sick of dying for a lost cause. Just like the Russian soldiers the year before, the German sailors refused to obey. A massive mutiny broke out in the port city of Kiel. The rebellion quickly spread into the mainland cities. Tired workers went on strike. Realizing he had entirely lost control of his nation and his military, the German Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, abdicated. He quietly packed his bags and fled across the border to the neutral Netherlands. The mighty German Empire was officially dead. A new, provisional German government was quickly formed in a state of absolute panic, and they desperately asked the Allies for a ceasefire. This brings us to one of our most important historical keywords: armistice. Listen very carefully to what this word means. An armistice is not a peace treaty. It does not permanently solve the political or geographical problems of a war. An armistice is simply a formal, legal agreement between enemies to immediately stop fighting so that peace talks can safely begin. You can practice this structure. The exhausted armies finally signed an armistice. Before dawn on November 11, 1918, German and Allied leaders met in a private railway carriage hidden deep in a quiet French forest. The terms of the armistice were incredibly harsh. Germany had to surrender its heavy weapons, its submarines, and massive amounts of territory. But they had no other choice. They signed the paper. The order went out across the telegraph wires. The fighting was mathematically scheduled to stop at exactly the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. At 10:59 a.m., the heavy artillery was still firing. Machine guns were still tearing up the mud. Young men were still falling dead into the dirt of the trenches. And then, the clock struck 11 a.m. For the first time in over 4 years, a strange, profound silence fell over the continent of Europe. The mechanical slaughterhouse completely stopped. Soldiers slowly lifted their heads above the dirt. They looked across no man's land, expecting to be shot, but nobody fired. We have now witnessed the sudden, silent terror of a global pandemic. We have seen how starvation and a massive naval mutiny pushed the German Empire over the brink. We understand exactly what an armistice is, and we have heard the thundering guns finally go quiet. The shooting is over. The surviving soldiers are going home to their families. But our mystery is not yet solved. The political leaders who meet in Paris to write the final peace treaty are about to make a terrible, fatal mistake. How do the winners of World War I accidentally plant the seeds for an even larger global war exactly 20 years later? The final tragedy is about to be written. The guns are finally silent. But in a glittering palace in France, men in suits are about to start a new war, using nothing but paper and ink. We ended Part 9 with the signing of the armistice. Remember, an armistice is simply a formal agreement to stop shooting. The physical mud of the trench was finally drying, but the massive, broken continent of Europe needed a permanent political solution. The mechanical slaughterhouse was closed, but the psychological wounds were wide open. In 1919, the victorious leaders traveled to Paris to write the final peace treaty. They chose to sign it at the magnificent Palace of Versailles, inside the famous Hall of Mirrors. Just a few hundred miles away, the earth is a destroyed wasteland of broken barbed wire, shattered forests, and human bones. But inside this room, underneath glittering crystal chandeliers, the most powerful men in the world are drawing new lines on a map. The old invisible alliance system we explored in Part 1 was completely shattered. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was gone. The Russian Empire was now the Soviet Union. The Ottoman Empire was carved up into new territories. British and French diplomats used rulers and pencils to draw artificial borders across the Middle East, entirely ignoring the cultural and religious realities of the people living there. Evidence suggests that the consequences of those simple pencil lines are still causing major global conflicts today. But the victorious leaders had completely different, conflicting goals. The American president, Woodrow Wilson, wanted to build a new world based on fairness and democracy. He proposed an idea called the League of Nations, an international group designed to solve global arguments peacefully without secret treaties. However, the French Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau, had a very different biological reaction to the war. France had been physically destroyed. Millions of young Frenchmen were dead. His primary goal was not international fairness. His goal was punishment. He wanted to ensure Germany could never, ever attack France again. This dramatic conflict of ideas led to the creation of the Treaty of Versailles. To understand why this document became a global disaster, we must learn a highly important historical word: reparations. In English, reparations are massive payments of money or materials made by a defeated nation to cover the damages of war. You can practice this structure. The defeated empire was forced to pay reparations. The treaty forced Germany to accept absolute 100% blame for starting the entire war. Because they were officially declared guilty, they were ordered to pay an impossible amount of financial reparations. The German economy, which was already starving from the naval blockade, was completely crushed. Furthermore, the treaty forced Germany to dismantle its military. To dismantle means to take something apart piece by piece, destroying its ability to function. The German army was dismantled and reduced to just 100,000 men. They were strictly forbidden from having an air force or building submarines. To make matters worse, we can use a common English idiom, adding insult to injury. This phrase means making a bad situation even worse by doing something deeply humiliating. Adding insult to injury, Germany was never actually invited to Paris. They were not allowed into the room to negotiate. They were simply handed the final piece of paper and told to sign it. Historians often call this a dictated peace. When a doctor treats a severe physical wound, they must carefully clean out the infection. If they simply put a dirty bandage over the wound, it will quickly rot and spread. The Treaty of Versailles was a dirty bandage. Instead of healing the psychological trauma of Europe, it planted a deep, poisonous seed in the minds of the German people. This brings us to our final emotional vocabulary word: resentment. Resentment is a feeling of deep, bitter anger toward an unfair situation or a perceived insult. When an entire nation feels extreme resentment, combined with the biological reality of poverty and starvation, they become highly vulnerable. They will desperately listen to any extreme leader who promises to tear up the unfair treaty, rebuild the dismantled army, and restore their national pride. Exactly 20 years later, a man named Adolf Hitler would use that exact resentment to drag the world into a second, even more destructive nightmare. We have now solved the mystery of World War I. We started our journey looking at a glittering surface hiding a deadly web of fear. We watched a teenage boy on a sunny Sarajevo sidewalk pull a trigger that caused a terrifying chain reaction. We saw how human biology failed in the mud and how the industrial arms race created an unstoppable machine. The Great War fundamentally changed what it means to be human. It proved that modern technology and civilized manners do not guarantee peace. It destroyed 4 ancient empires, birthed new nations, and showed us that a single, fateful decision can trap the entire world in a burning room. The glittering surface is always fragile. Keep questioning history, keep looking beneath the surface, and keep listening for the echoes of the past.